Hello and welcome to week 2 of Pedagogy Powwows, and we are continuing Nurtured by Love by Shin'ichi Suzuki, and I'm reading part 2 today. So this should be a pretty quick one because most of part 2 is autobiographical, but there are some really good lessons that he shares from his own personal stories that I think can apply pretty broadly. And apparently Suzuki did too, which is why he's sharing these stories. So he starts with a story of Toyota Koji, who was one of his early students that he started training, I believe, around 4 years old. This student was particularly special to him, not only because he ended up becoming a prestigious violinist, namely the principal concertmaster for the Berlin Radio Symphony Orchestra, but also because he ended up living with Suzuki during the last years of World War II. Unfortunately, Koji's parents were killed, and Suzuki took it upon himself to find his former student and look after him, which he did from approximately age 16 until adulthood. So, some really good things that he talked about in here while relating the story of Koji. He writes about this time in which Koji, age 3, was holding a super small 16-size violin, and it got media attention. And the headline read, "A child prodigy appears." And he writes, with a large photo of Koji taken while he performed. "This was a most regrettable betrayal of what I had repeatedly emphasized to the reporters prior to the recital. There is no innate talent called genius. Genius is an honorific term given to human beings who have been fostered to achieve magnificence. I recall that this episode took place 34 or 35 years ago." This is really just reiterating the point that Suzuki made earlier in the book, that part integral to his philosophy is he doesn't believe that talent is innate. It is mastered. It is practiced. It is acquired through effort, time, and effective teaching. It's important to point out that he saw the media attention, which I think most of us, if we're honest, if any of our students were to receive that kind of attention, we'd feel pretty good about ourselves. But he has the opposite reaction. He actually calls it a betrayal. And I think that that really highlights and emphasizes just how important it was to Suzuki that his students were not, they were not selected based on some sort of sense that they were talented or gifted, that he didn't screen his students at all. He accepted anyone that came to him whom he was able to teach. And that through his method and love of teacher and parent, the child would achieve at a higher level as a human being, not just as a musician or a violinist. So I liked this part too. Moving on from that, I also liked these words that he wrote. In other words, having fun playing the violin was Koji's life from before he could remember anything. He started around 3 years old. This was wholly aside from any question of whether he liked or disliked the violin. This is precisely the same as the process by which all Japanese children learn Japanese, completely separate from whether or not they like doing so. So I think this emphasizes a point that I made in my last video that he didn't really touch on earlier. And that is, I think a more pernicious problem today is parents only consider music if their child shows interest in it. Otherwise, it's just kind of maybe something you listen to occasionally, or it's for those people. Right? It's for people who have an interest in doing band or being an orchestra geek or whatever it may be. Suzuki is really proposing that music be part of the culture, to the point where a child doesn't even think about whether they like it or not. It's just something that they do. I thought that was interesting and a good point to have. So he does also go on and he lists some of his other students who were successful professionally as musicians. And he lists some of their names as well as positions that they held. Then he writes this: "Without exception, every one of my students was accepted into my studio without any kind of screening whatsoever. Every child develops. Everything depends on how they are fostered. This was my principle as I guided the development of those lively children, and they have marvelously borne out the claim." So again, he does take pride in the position and the success that his students have had, but he also points to this being developed in them over the years through the principle of his method that every child can learn. And that is actually the name of the course that any Suzuki teacher has to take today. It's called Every Child Can, to underlie that principle. So moving on, he goes on to discuss some of the struggles that he and his family went through during World War II. He had to use his father's factory to manufacture boating parts, and, had to leave. I don't think he ever quite left music, but he was not teaching to the same extent that he was prior to the war. When he heard about Tokyo, he decided to do a radio broadcast to search for Koji, and that's how he found Koji, who was then living with his uncle. And Koji joins the Suzuki family. And I find this interesting too, because Koji ends up becoming very successful professional violinist, and Suzuki takes this opportunity, not getting into too much detail, but to make it clear that even though Koji had loving parents, even though he had been taught violin from a very young age, he had something very traumatic happen in his life. And as a result, he was put in a place that was not as good for his development, and he struggled. It was not an easy transition to have Koji join their family, and he talks about some beautiful ways that they helped him adjust to being part of their family, and to just, again, help Koji rise above some of the struggles he had in a way that wasn't pedantic or lectury, but just reminding him of a higher calling in life. He goes on to say that during those years that Koji struggled, he became very devoutly religious and Catholic, and to the point where he thought he might become a Catholic priest. And Suzuki makes it clear that he would have been proud if that was the option that Koji had taken. He did not feel that his students needed to become professional musicians in order to prove themselves worthy of the training they had. Rather, he hoped that the musical education they had would help them develop into better persons no matter what their calling. So this was a section that I thought was really lovely. After one of his lessons, I told Koji, who was now able to play Bach's Chaconne very well, "Today I would like you to go to the church and play in front of Christ. Play the Chaconne with all your heart for him to hear." "Yes, sir, I'll be on my way then," he replied, and left immediately with his violin. An hour or so later, he reported back, "I'm home. I played the Chaconne at church." "Good. How was it?" No one else was there, and it felt very comfortable. "I'm glad. From now on, no matter where you are, where or when you play, it will be a good idea always to assume that you are playing for Christ. Yes, sir, he replied, his cheerful face brightening even more. He was always a responsive one. From my life experience, I have come to believe strongly in the importance for young people, including those who may be readers of this volume, to interact with outstanding people. Through doing that, we unconsciously enhance our heart, sensibility, and conduct. Indeed, I think this is a fundamental condition of character building. He goes on to tell this other story about Koji and another student he had where Suzuki, surprises them with a new song and tells them, you are going to be playing this live on the radio tomorrow. Have fun learning. And the two students, I think they were teenagers, took off and practiced all day and ended up playing beautifully on the radio. And I read this and I thought, wow, perhaps I'm not challenging my students enough. But he definitely was emphasizing again the importance of encouraging children to rise above, to surround themselves with what he calls excellent people. And he continues showing that through the teachers he helps his students who do become professional musicians select. He helps them select teachers that will help them be masters and what he calls wonderful people as well, human beings. So it definitely did challenge me. I really like this concept of calling children to higher things and not assuming that they don't have an understanding of what it means to play for God or what it might mean to, seek inspiration, seek encouragement, seek to learn from skilled people, seek to learn from good people. I think that, what that looks like implementing in my own practice, I'm not 100% sure, but I do think it's worth chewing on, worth meditating on. I believe that in our society today, our expectations for children are too low. And where they're too high, they're only too high because we haven't given the proper training. We haven't patiently gone through the proper training. I think children require a lot more attention than we think they do, but that attention should be diverting them to higher things that we may even think are outside of their ability. Taking those small steps to develop their skills in a way that will produce fruit over the course of years and not instantaneously. I think that's really important to teach children. Something I could definitely think on more and what that looks like with my own students without becoming too preachy. So I think that that's definitely worth meditating on. So this was another story that re-emphasized that idea of surrounding yourself or thinking on the higher things or surrounding yourself with excellent people. He talks about another student he had. He writes, one year, before she had gone away to Europe, Shida Tomiko was to perform La Poème by Ernest Chausson at one of those evening concerts. However, during our ride together in a car headed for the hall, Tomiko told me, Sensei, this piece is so difficult. I'm feeling a little nervous. What is it that's worrying you? I prompted her. Are you playing that marvelous piece for the audience? Your performance is not some kind of merchandise to put on display, Don't think of it as a show for an audience. It's fine to make mistakes. If you flub something, you can play it again. Tonight, I want you to play that divine piece before the spirit of the composer, face to face with Chausson's wonderfully poetic soul and his depth of emotion. See if you can communicate back your own emotional response. If you do that, there is nothing to worry about. You will be in a world where there is nobody and nothing except you and Chausson. I really liked that, and it actually challenged me because I do like performance. I think most people have some joy in performing for an audience, but there's also a lot of anxieties that come out of it. And then there's a lot of sense of not ever having enough, not having satisfaction in it. The depth that he is calling his students to. I love the aspect of appreciation for composers and musicians who have done it before us and have done it better. It really reminds me of an idea that Mortimer Adler talked about in his book, How to Read a Book. And I'm summarizing, but essentially the argument that he is making is if you read an excellent book and after reading it, you are none the wiser. Like you're not any more educated on that particular issue than you were before reading the book. You've done the author a disservice. Like these authors who have done these works like for us and passed them on for us, they want us to rise to the level that they have risen to. They don't want to remain above us. And that kind of reminded me of what he's saying of, take some time to express gratitude for this composer and play for him, like really try to connect with the depth of emotion and just soul that he would play with, and think about that. So another good challenging thought. So I think this passage, again, was much more autobiographical, and some of these more loftier ideals, not necessarily practical, but I think it's good to take some time to talk about those loftier ideals. They often get lost in a world that may only care about the technical or the pedagogical without really getting into the philosophy or some of just that deeper soulful understanding and appreciation for music and how it enriches our lives. Thank you so much for joining and listening to this. I hope to do another video again in another week for section 3. Have a great day.